Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on the Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, Professor Stephen Nagy, who is Associate Professor at the Christian University in Tokyo, and me, the host, Maya Matsuoka. So we are very happy to have you here again tonight. Our theme today is geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific, why rules-based order. So there are a lot of questions. I believe that every one of you has a different view on this theme, and I invite you to come up and share your views and opinions with Stephen and me when Stephen finishes with the briefing. So it will be probably in maybe 20 minutes or so. This discussion is open. It is here because of you. We appreciate you being with us, and we would like to give you opportunities to talk with us and again share your thoughts. So, Stephen, shall we begin?
Thank you very much, Maya, and thank you very much to everybody that's joined the Clubhouse room tonight. Tonight I'm speaking from Canberra, so I'm in Canberra, Australia for a couple of days to do some talks, and then I'll move to Sydney on the 21st. But yeah, there's some really interesting questions about why we talk about the Indo-Pacific region in terms of a rules-based order. And I think it's useful for us to be thinking about the kind of rules-based order that we've enjoyed since the end of World War II. In that period, for the most part, we've seen trade be regulated. We've seen the movement of people be regulated. We've seen sea lines of communication be regulated by international law. By and large, we've seen international disputes be regulated. And I think this has provided a very good platform for stable and peaceful development for the most part until recently. So when we're talking about rules-based order, we're talking about creating a stable platform for how different countries engage with each other, solve disputes, create trade regulations, thinking about the guardrails of what states can do to their citizens, what states can do to other countries. And we're at a point, I think, in history where we're being challenged at many levels in terms of the rules-based order. The most recent example of the challenges to a rules-based order, of course, is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Ukraine is a sovereign state. Interesting enough, it has given up its nuclear weapons. It has a military, but a military that has not gone on the offensive in Russia. And what we've seen is Russia willfully invade a sovereign state that hasn't attacked it first. And I think this is a very good example of where the rules that we've been used to or accustomed to have failed. We haven't been able to push back against Mr. Putin's Russia. We haven't been able to stop the conflict. And it suggests that we may need a new rules-based order that takes into consideration states that do challenge the rules that we've developed in the post-World War II period. So Russia presents a really good example. Another example stems from the emergence of new technologies. And I see that Eleanor is on the call, and I'm going to call her up for sure, but also Chao Ting and others. When we're thinking about the digital environment and the digital economy, and what are the standards that are going to be used in the next 20 or 30 years. Now, the standards that we use for the internet today were by and large developed in the United States in a relatively open economy, in a relatively rules-based economy, in an economy that functions based on rule of law and independent judiciary. And as a result, these have been really a global public good. But of course, some states, in particular Russia and China, really don't feel comfortable with the cyber rules that have been established by the United States. And they're advocating for something called cyber sovereignty. So I think this is another really good example where states are thinking about a rules-based order and how we negotiate the rules of how we use the internet and now how we use the digital economy. This is interesting because the digital economy has become much more predominant in our lives. All of us on the call today have been through the COVID-19 pandemic over the past 2.5 years, and I would be very shocked if any of you didn't order anything through Amazon.com or Alibaba or any of these online merchants. And this is a really good example of the digital economy. How do we regulate this? How do we regulate the privacy associated with the digital economy? And what is the role of states in the digital economy? And this is another interesting area where we're thinking about the importance of fostering or creating a rules-based order. And in general, we're thinking about a transparent rules-based order that prejudices none, if that is all possible, and provides public goods to all. We've seen other challenges in terms of the post-World War II order, and to be frank, it's not just challenges by China. I think that the second invasion of Iraq by the United States is an example of the United States rejecting the post-World War II order. The United Nations General Assembly rejected the United States rationale for going to war in Iraq. So I want to make sure that I'm balanced in discussing this. But I think challenges have emerged much more recently, in particular in the South China Sea and the East China Sea and across the Taiwan Straits. In the South China Sea, up to really 2016, the sea lines of communication that we use to import and export resources in and out of the region and energy resources, about $5 trillion a year, US dollars, now are potentially subject to states that are not following international law. And here I'm talking about UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Seas. In late 2014, China began building artificial islands in the South China Sea. They militarized those islands in the South China Sea, and now are claiming that they have sovereignty over not only over those islands, but over the so-called 9-line area. So this is another example of states challenging international law that they've signed. And in this case, China has signed the United Nations Law of the Seas, but they're rejecting its basis. Now, we should be frank, the United States hasn't signed the UNCLOS agreement, but they tend to behave in accordance with the law of the seas. So I think this is really an important distinction. So what we see, whether it's Russia, whether it's the digital economy, whether it is the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the Taiwan Straits in terms of sea lines of communication, we see clear challenges to the rules-based order that we've become accustomed to. And this order has been very much the basis for the stability and prosperity and development of the global economy and the regional economy in the post-World War II period. So the question is why are we thinking about the importance of a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific? And here, as I mentioned, those 3 or 4 examples, is that the order is being challenged, and primarily it's being challenged by China, but frankly, it's also being challenged now by Russia. And this is creating anxieties and concerns about what is the future direction of how we think about trade, how we think about the role of government, how we think about in the digital economy, how we think about privacy, how we think about the role of government in negotiating, in particular, the digital platform. So in a sense, when we're talking about the rules-based order, we're talking about standards, we're talking about the boundaries of competition, we're talking about potentially the boundaries of conflict, and right now we're seeing challenges. Now, as a response to the challenges that have been put forward by primarily China, but also Russia to a certain extent, and as I mentioned, the United States has not been an innocent bystander in this process. What we see is states like Japan, and I'm going to focus on Japan today, but others as well, have put forward the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, where they're advocating for buttressing the international rules-based system that we've become accustomed to over the past 30 or 40 decades. Over the past 3 or 4 decades. We've also seen states like Japan, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, Peru, and Mexico signed what's called the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And here, this is another example of states trying to buttress or strengthen the rules-based order and how we think about trade in the digital economy, and how we think about environmental law, labor law, how we think about the role of state-owned enterprises, and such that it's the market that is shaping a competition, not the state. These are all really good examples of how states like Japan and Australia and Canada are trying to create the rules of the road to how we think about trade, in particular the high value trade, intellectual property rights, and the protection of our research and development. We also see other trade rules, less, I guess, high-value trade rules, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, where the ASEAN plus 6 countries, minus India, have agreed to trade and lower tariffs on particular products. So this is another example of setting the rules. Other examples include mini trade deals like the one we saw between Japan and the United States, really trying to create rules of the road in terms of how we think about the digital economy and agriculture. NAFTA 2.0, the agreement that was negotiated under the Mexicans, the Canadians, and the United States, also has renegotiated the rules of the road to try and create new boundaries and new ways to be thinking about how we engage in trade. So the rules-based order really, I think, is meant to curb the power of the so-called great powers or the superpowers. In this particular case, we're thinking about the United States, China, and Russia, as they've probably been the most flagrant breakers of the international system and rules. And this is meant to curb the power, but also protect middle powers and smaller powers from the asymmetric powers that these great powers have. And that's a really important point, and it's important in terms of bringing stability within the region and ensuring that rules are the final arbiter of how states interact, not force. And if you look at some of the reasons for World War I and World War II, really what we saw is the great powers competing for territory and for resources, and not really thinking about the interests of smaller states. So today, what we're seeing is primarily middle powers, but I think they are supported by the United States and India to a certain extent, really trying to invest in creating a framework of rules that will set the boundaries for how states interact with each other in a way that they ensure that great powers and how they use power is controlled, or at least mitigated, and ensures that middle powers and smaller powers don't succumb to the asymmetric power differences that are becoming increasingly widened as China and the United States continue to grow, and other countries, whether it's Japan and others, fall behind. And here, being in Australia, I encourage you to take a look at the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index 2021 and 2022. And they give you a fluid sense of how states are increasing in power and how states are decreasing in power. Their last edition really demonstrated that countries like China have dropped a little bit. The United States has come up under the Biden administration. But overall, we see China moving up to a center of power, and it uses those relationships to shape the behavior of smaller states in its region. So in a nutshell, I just want to stress that the rules-based order is meant to curb the power of great powers. It's meant to protect middle powers and smaller powers from whether it's economic coercion or bullying or other actions by great powers. It's meant to curb the behavior and create a framework or a set of rules of how states behave. At this particular stage, we're struggling, quite frankly. We've seen momentum on the trade front in terms of intellectual property rights, environmental law, labor law, and curbing the role of state-owned enterprises with the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. South Korea is interested in joining. The UK's application is on the table. Taiwan and China both have launched applications to join in a sense that they understand that this is the way forward in terms of keeping trade flowing, but creating rules that states can agree with. In the maritime domain, we're still challenged, and I think the gray zone operations that Japan has experienced in and around the Senkaku Islands, the gray zone operations in and around in the East Filipino Sea and in the South China Sea in general, pressuring the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, are a challenge to the rules-based order, but also the pressure on Taiwan in terms of Chinese incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So these are real areas of challenge, and they could spiral or cascade into a conflict or some kind of regional friction, which could destabilize the regional trading environment and regional sea lines of communication, but also the global economy. And I think that we've become much more aware of how interconnected we are and how something, for example, that's happening in Ukraine can affect supply chains in terms of food, water, nickel, and other items. And we've also seen this in China over the past few months with almost 400 million people in some form of lockdown. And the most, I guess, salacious or the biggest example of this is, of course, is the city of Shanghai with 25 or 28 million people under the lockdown. This affects supply chains, it disrupts trade, and it will destabilize relations if we don't establish rules of how we engage in trade, but also how we engage in and manage issues such as non-traditional security issues such as COVID-19. So that's a few thoughts to put on the table. I encourage anybody that wants to come up and share their thoughts to jump in.
I'm not sure whether you have seen the question which was posted under the post about tonight's room. Who creates the rules? So earlier you mentioned that the standards which we use for cyber security are created in the United States, but generally, so I believe that it's a very good question to people who are not very much into geopolitics. Who creates the rules of this rules-based order?
Well, in the post-World War II period, it was primarily the United States that reached out, and they created our economic system. They created GATT, as well as other financial and regulatory systems to ensure that the global economy could engage in commerce. And it did this because, well, quite simply, the United States after World War II was the only economy that was left standing. At that particular time, I think it occupied about 55 or 60% of global GDP. Japan was in tatters, Korea was in tatters, China was in tatters, most of Europe was in tatters. So the United States led the rule-making process in the post-World War II period in cooperation with its European partners. And this is, I think, is one of the reasons why countries like China feel uncomfortable with the current rules-based system, is that they feel they weren't part of the process of making those rules. Now, as the decades went by in the post-World War II period, of course, we saw Japan join the OECD countries again. It became the fastest growing economy until its bubble burst in the late 80s. The newly industrialized economies of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, they all benefited from this system. And quite frankly, China's 40 years of reform and opening up benefited from this system. So there's a question of who made these rules, but I think the initial rules that were made didn't prejudice countries if they followed those rules. But of course, if they didn't, it created problems. And this is where the Chinese, until they switched their position and opened up their economy, they started to benefit from the rules. Russia, of course, is a different case. And during the Soviet Union, it didn't follow the rules. And in the post-Soviet Union case, it became a kleptocratic, corrupt state and that couldn't negotiate the rules. So I think that today there are so many new technologies and new spheres of competition that are being discussed and evolving that do require a new set of rules. The question is this, who should be making those rules and what would be the basis for making those rules? And I think the greatest tension here, Maya, is that in most Western countries, we have created a set of rules, and we call it rule of law, that not only are meant for trade and for ruling citizens, but also for ruling leaders. And what we see in particular in the Chinese context, they're advocating for a rule by law system where the state or the party is not subject to the same rules as the people that they're governing. And in this sense, there's a substantial difference if a state such as China makes the rules, or if it's a state like United States or Germany or France makes the rules, in that we will have a big contrast between rule by law and rule of law. And I think these are this is an important distinction when we're thinking about who makes the rules and why it's important.
Yes, that's really important to remember. And I cannot help but think that in most of the challenges which which are posed by different countries, we can see that the basis of those challenges or the disagreement, for example, by countries like China or Russia, probably let's say in the core, we can see lack of trust and also willingness to support and to preserve their political systems. So not to change those political systems, because obviously those systems have worked for the political regimes there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there are, we have domestic systems that have particular rules, and then we have an international system that has rules. The challenge is at the borders where those two systems interact. And I think that increasingly, as the strategic competition between the United States and China evolves, what we're seeing is that these systems are becoming increasingly incompatible. In that the one-party state in China that employs a rule by law system views law as something as a tool for the government to control citizens and to develop the state, and not being bound by the same laws as its citizens. And I think in the U.S. case, and of course it's it's an imperfect state as well, with corruption and not always embodying the values of its rule of law system, but in general, we see the laws of the United States shaping and curbing the behavior of leaders as well.
Eleanor, you were first here up with us. So if you would like to share your thoughts on this, please go ahead and do it. So.
Good morning, Maya and Stephen. Well, at least in Washington, it's morning. I'm sorry. Good evening to you both, I guess. Or good evening to everyone else. Great to be here as always, and such a rich discussion as always. It's great that to start off that Stephen did talk a bit about norms of what I would call like there are norms of external conduct versus norms that are more oriented towards domestic rules. So when I say external conduct, I think of like dispute, reconciling disputes of some kind, such as like the United Nations law of the seas arbitration process through third-party adjudicators, as well as like trade liberalization, and then norms of domestic rule, I would say would entail more like rule of law in terms of how leaders govern their own people and that of like free markets. So I'm glad that you talked about that and touched that a bit. In regards to critical technologies, I heard Stephen mention my name earlier, if I remember correctly. That is, that's definitely a very hot topic here in Washington and elsewhere. And I mean, I think one thing that I'm not terribly well versed in the matter, but there's a bit of like, I guess, friction over is perhaps rules on privacy between Washington and that of Europe, because Europeans, I believe, see privacy as a more like a human right, if I'm putting it correctly, in the way that perhaps American lawmakers and other stakeholders in the U.S. may not necessarily have caught up with that idea just yet. So I think it'll be interesting to see in the realm of emerging critical technologies or just the digital world, where privacy fits into all that, because that is something that it is increasingly harder, as Stephen mentioned, with the pandemic. We are now living in a much more internet-oriented world, and what we do online, that data is stored somewhere. So, and I think that is coming increasingly of concern to many people. They do value their own privacy. So I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes. As for the maritime realm, which I'm always interested in, particularly in the South China Sea, Stephen put it correctly. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was, I believe it was correct in 1982, was meant for member parties to follow and adhere to the articles that are enshrined in UNCLOS even to this day. For better or worse, the United States has not ratified UNCLOS. For what I understand, for more domestic reasons. I don't see that there is going to be political bandwidth anytime in the near future for the United States to ratify. People who argue for the United States to ratify UNCLOS, I do believe, say that the United States is missing out on some of the conversations that have to do with maritime law, that have to do with rule of the seas, that it's currently missing out on it. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. But on the other hand, the United States is not, of course, a claimant party in the South China Sea. And I think that's something that the PRC has kind of argued for in terms of the United States is like, emphasis on all claimant parties, as well as, just countries that are have some sort of investment in the Indo-Pacific to adhere to the 2016 arbitration case where the Philippines actually went to China, to the International Criminal Court, and said that China is 9-line has no legal grounding, which that's what the arbitration actually did decide. But my also interest is that I think what Stephen remembers when I first talked to him was the fact that Taiwan is also not necessarily agreeing to the 2016 arbitration case for other reasons. It is actually the original author under the ROC government, I should say, of the 9-line, though originally was an 11-line. We can talk more about that if anybody else is interested. So, but one of the problems with what China's, for example, island reclamation activities is that the arbitration's 500, I think it's like 500 some page document made clear is that because of those island reclamation activities, third-party adjudicators or any other stakeholders or individual will never entirely know what the status of those land or subland features were to begin with before China commenced those land reclamation activities. Why is that important? Because it's important for the purpose of creating borders such as like exclusive economic zones, or EEZs for short, where countries have exclusive economic rights in the water. So for that as a reason, that is why I would say that international law is very important for the purpose of the maritime law, and among so many other reasons if we're going to talk about the South China Sea. So I'll stop there to see if others have comments, but thank you so much for always letting me engage in these conversations.
Thanks, Eleanor. I think you tied up a lot of knots that I missed, so I appreciate that input.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Chao Ting. Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Maya, and good evening, Stephen. So I remember we have discussed this issue in the past sessions, and today we can discuss this topic again. So I think this topic is very meaningful. So I want to also say something for this topic. If we are talking about rules-based international order, so we have to understand why the Western countries have advocated a rule-based order. I mean, Western countries, I mean European countries, the US and Japan, and even India. All of them have promoted a rules-based international order very actively. Why? So I'm asking why. I think the reason is that they have the advantage. They are very good at defining rule. They are very good at establishing a formal institution like EU. Okay, EU is a very successful international institution based on rules. And Stephen has also emphasized the fact that the international order after World War II is mainly established by the US. Why? Because the US are very good at defining rules, and they have the power to enforce such rules. I think the international order, especially the current so-called rules-based liberal international order, are established by the US. It's an extension of US domestic governance model. For US, the rule of law is always important, and it's a principle of the governance. US is very good at it. US a country ruled by the lawyers. Okay, they are very good at defining explicit and formal rules. So, in terms of international order, this is their advantage. So they should take advantage of their advantages. So this is my understanding why they are promoting a rules-based international order. On the other hand, for other developing countries, for China and Russia, they are not good at defining rules. Why? Because they have no such culture. The Western societies are based on rule of law, but the Chinese society is based on relation. So we have seen the conflict between the two governance models, the rules-based international order and the relational governance model. I'm sure Professor Nagi knows Professor Chen Yaqin of China. He has created one new theory of international theory. He calls it as relational international relations theory. So for Professor Chen Yaqin, the Chinese relational governance model is very different from that of the rules-based international order. What are the differences? So for the rules-based international order, there are formal and explicit rules which can regulate the behavior of individual countries and organizations. This is true, and this is really good if the rules are fair. But Professor Chen Yaqin argues that sometimes rules cannot solve all the problem because our societies are human, and rules are strict, and sometimes rules are rigid. Therefore, we should also recognize the importance of relational governance model, especially in the East Asia societies. he has made some explanation of this governance model. He has taken ASEAN as one example. ASEAN, ASEAN is very different from European Union. European Union is governed by clear and formal rules, but for ASEAN, they don't have too much rules. Okay, and the interaction is based on relation. But ASEAN is also very successful, and it's in accordance with Asian culture. So ASEAN is another different model. So for Professor Chen Yaqin, the relational governance model is not contradiction of rules-based order. They could be complementary. They are not mutually exclusive. So I think the fundamental difference between rules-based law, rules-based order and the relational governance model is that they have different cultural foundation. The Western society is based on rule, but the Asian society, especially the Confucian societies, are based on relation. And the rules have defined a bottom line to regulate the behavior of people and countries. But for the relational society, they pursue a model standard. So they have different approaches. I don't know which one is more suitable for today's international order. But I think there is a competition between U.S. and China when it comes to the international order. The U.S. is always actively promoting rules-based order, and China is promoting relational governance model. BRI is one example. I'm not in the position to judge which one is better, but I think there is a competition. I mean, the U.S.-China competition has an ideological dimension, which includes the competition of governance model, for example, the rules-based order and the relational governance model. So I don't know which one will win. It depends on the competition of the two superpowers. But I personally prefer rules-based order because this is better for the smaller countries, for middle powers, because all the countries must respect the rule. The powerful countries should respect the sovereignty of smaller countries, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine has violated the international law. International law is also kind of rule. So this is bad for the weaker countries. So therefore, I believe rules-based order is better for smaller and weaker countries. But we must acknowledge that the rules must be fair for all, because this is sometimes ironic if you are talking about a rules-based order. But we have one question: who can enforce the rules? Who? I think only the powerful countries. The rules, the international order, rules-based international order after World War II was created mainly by the U.S. and enforced by the U.S. But who can regulate the U.S.? This is another big question. So sometimes we promote a rules-based order, but actually this order is based on power, because only the powerful country can enforce the rules. So this is a contradiction, in my opinion. So sorry, I have spoken too much. Maybe not very clear, but this is my opinion. Thank you, Stephen. I look forward to your comments.
So Xiaoting, that was really insightful. And if anybody is interested in the book that he mentioned, it's called Relational Theory. And the scholar is Chen Yaqin from the Chinese Foreign Affairs University. And the book has been printed by Oxford University. I encourage you to take a look at it because it provides, I think we would understand it in the West as a constructivist view of international relations, where Chen Yaqin puts it as a uniquely Chinese interpretation of international relations. Xiaoting, you would agree with that?
Yes. I have just read his book. Very insightful.
Yeah. So I do think that's interesting, and as he talks about relationships as being the kind of the basis for how we engage in problem solving, I think that is actually generally true for the international domain on the most part in the Chinese context, but we see, of course, lots of counter examples, whether it's Lithuania or Czech or South Korea or Japan or the Philippines, when the relationship doesn't match what I think the central government in Beijing has dictated or would prefer. So I think that there's lots of contradictions in how Qin Yaqin articulates a relational theory and the practice by the party. And I'm not sure if he has made the connection between a Marxist-Leninist state that with Chinese characteristics and what he articulates as relational theory, this traditional importance of relationships in dealing with international issues. A second point I want to make is I'm not sure if that theory is applicable to the areas that we're talking about today, whether it's cyber sovereignty or the digital economy or the maritime environment, in particular, as states are no longer so deferential to whatever the government is in Beijing. And this is a really important question, and I'd love to hear Xiaoting or Eleanor or Lin or Mar's comments on that.
Okay, maybe we can invite Amar. Amar, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Well, it's about new rule-based order, right?
Yes, it is.
So it will be the kind of like union, or it's like ally. It will be what, only for the trade, for the free trade, because it's already established like Indo-Pacific allies, like AUKUS, or it's kind of like in Asian Pacific area. There is a lot of organizations already facilitated. And I guess now world is really changing very fast, and there is it's weaponizing the oil, weaponizing the kind of like SWIFT, or is what they have here. They are using the independence of the other countries to make advantage, and it's but world is too dependent in each other. Every country is dependent in each other. It's kind of like become very complex issue, and when we have, it's good idea that we have a rule of or order, or we have some based on some map or some principle, some guide us into the what we can do or what we can. It's we need some kind of like guideline for, and I guess it will be good. We need to first to define the main the principle, to agree each countries, or because some of the countries is using the advantage is blocking the trade, and then I think there is any initial idea, or do you have any principle is already you can, or are you defined anything yet? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amar. So I generally think that how at least Japan and Australia and other countries are defining a so-called rules-based order is based on the system that was developed in the post-World War II system. And that system initially, as Xiaoting and I mentioned, was championed by the United States. But what was unique about it is that the United States allowed other countries to provide input and shape that international system. So today, the International Monetary Fund, its president is a European, I believe, or the World Bank is president is an American. International Monetary Fund is a European. The ABD, Asian Development Bank, is Japanese. So they were allowed or permitted, or through discussions they came to a consensus that they could build additional institutions to support the international system. And we've seen at the United Nations level, but also in many international organizations, international law, where there is general buy-in by many countries for the current system, and they've continued to shape it through dialogue and consensus. And I think that this has continued up until really the 2000s. And what we've seen is today that international system that I think both Russia and China feel is dominated by Western values, in particular rule of law, untransparency and so-called democratic decision-making is something that is contradictory to their domestic international system. And this is creating challenges in terms of how they are engaging and thinking about how to change the international system so that it's frankly safer for their domestic regimes. And this is a really, really interesting part of this discussion, is that there's a competition between keeping the rules and strengthening the rules and developing new rules for emerging technologies such as the digital economy or cyberspace, or probably for AI and quantum computing. So that is probably open to discussion, and keeping some of the rules of the current system that are quite that do promote development, do promote proper trade. So I think there's a bit of a tension there. But as I go back to my point, is that the nature of the regimes, so one that is rule of law and one is rule by law, means that they have an interest in understanding what rules are there. And China, if you know a little bit about China, they have something called the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. And one of the core principles is non-interference. And I think that for the Chinese, they believe that the current international system has the potential to interfere in their domestic regime and their domestic governance. And this is something that they're completely against.
So I hope this answers your question, Amar. And we've got also Lynn. Lynn, hello.
Yes, so hello. So our topic today is about the rules-based order. So the very first thing come to my mind when talking about it is that order is led by the West, the US, and countries like Japan. It often emphasize the idea of promoting the rules-based order because it benefits the most from that order. However, I think that that idea is not something that authoritarian countries like China it does not like, and it has a lot of suspicion about that order. So I think that's why we have like a lot of discussion about China's aggression or China's violation of international rule, something like that. Professor Stephen, could you share like about from the China's point of view, what it views or how it understands the current rules-based order, and what kind of rule-based order that China decides from when they want to get involved in multilateral platforms like ASEAN or ASEAN-centered trade agreement like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Agreement, and most recently it wants to join the TPP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. So I think this is a couple questions. So the first question is, how does China view the current international order, or international system, a rules-based system? And I think that it depends which China we're talking about. PRC China, or the Communist Party of China, has a very different view about the international system than Republic of China. And I think that is an important distinction. And one is a democratic political entity, and the other is a one-party state. And they have different interpretations about the current international rules-based order based on their different political systems. So in the case of Taiwan, as a political entity, it has probably less problems with the current political order. In fact, it was the Republic of China that represented China at the 1952 Paris Peace Accords, or San Francisco Accords. So I think that they had one view. The Communist Party has another view, because I think, again, the international system as we know today, which focuses on international law, curbing the power of states, ensuring that states are bound by international law, goes against their fundamental principles, those 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So that is one level of analysis. Second is, I think that if we think about China more as a civilizationary state, and Xiaoting and we've spoke about this before, they look at China's position over a longer period of time, and they see whether it's territorial issues or how to behave in the region as being embedded in historical practices. And Xiaoting mentioned the relational theory. So relationships is the basis for how we engage in international relations. So in that sense, they view the current international system as not taking into account China's historical practices in the region. Now, whether that's true or not, I think there's lots of debate, as China is has many different dynasties, and each dynasty had different characteristics and different levels of acceptance of its regional neighbors, and different levels of outward lookingness and inward lookingness. So I hesitate to think about China historically as a single homogeneous and monolithic political entity. So I think you need to look at it in a period, from a period. So that's one way to think about it. I think the current Chinese Communist Party look at the international system, and the specific areas that they would like to change have to do with discourse and particular understandings about human rights, development, and democracy, and how international institutions work. So I think that they would like to redefine human rights as to be collective rights rather than individual rights. I think when they talk about democracy, and if you look at the summit between Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken and Wang Jie and Wang Yi back in Alaska in 2020, in March, Yang Jie, state counselor, specifically said that the United States' democracy does not represent Chinese democracy or other democracies. So they want to redefine democracy to be about development and collective and the collective voice of people. On how international institutions work, I think that they would like to make it less democratic, less transparent, and more relational. And by doing that, this will curb the power of international institutions so that they can't interfere in Chinese domestic politics or other countries' domestic politics. So that's how I would answer your question. And I encourage anybody else that can add value to that to please step in and share your view.
Excuse me, Stephen. Just now you have talked about digital trade, and you have emphasized the rules of digital trade. I think this is another important point. As far as I know, Kurt Campbell has mentioned that the U.S. will provide an Indo-Pacific economic framework very soon, and digital trade and the digital economy are very important part of the Indo-Pacific economic framework. So it's time to define the rules of digital trade. I think the U.S. has realized the urgency and the importance. So on Chinese side, it's the same. As we have discussed previously, Professor Yan Xuetong of Tsinghua University has argued that today's digital economy is the main part of international competition. International geopolitical competition is no longer about territory or manufacture, but about digital economy. The Chinese economy, more than 40% of Chinese economy is related to digital economy. So therefore, the rules of digital economy is important for the when we talk about great power rivalry. So I think the U.S. has made it very clear that they have the agenda of defining the rules of digital economy. So if we can talk about this from geopolitical perspective, I think it's about geopolitical power. Okay, if you can define the rules of digital economy, that means you will have advantage in terms of geopolitical competition. I remember President Obama has very clearly said, I will not allow China to define the rules of the roads. So I think this is a focus of geopolitical competition of superpowers. Who will define the rules of digital economy, and how will the rules look like? So it's not only about the rules per se. It's also about power competition. So I think the U.S. has obviously advantage in terms of defining rules, because the U.S. has a lot of good lawyers. Many politicians have no background. Many have studied law. And Chinese politicians are good at interpersonal relations, but they are not good at defining rules. So that's why they promote a relational governance model, because they are good at that. So this is my observation. I mean, the great power competition has extended from traditional fields to digital domain, and who can win this competition? will be the future winner of the international competition.
Yeah, I would agree. It's about, we call it standards, right? Who creates the standards? So as I mentioned in the example of the internet, we have those standards, and this is why that the internet we have similar global standards, and that the United States has benefited economically the most from setting those standards. And I think the competition for AI or quantum computing or the digital economy is all similarly focused. Is who's going to make the standards will shape how we think about governance, privacy, trade, many different areas. I just wanted to, I guess, make a comment that when we think about rules, or when we think about the Chinese strengths in terms of relations, I'm not sure if those are exportable, and this creates challenges for the Chinese relational political system. How how applicable are they outside the Chinese sphere, and in particular, not just the Chinese sphere, but outside the China in general. And here, I think this is a really big question. The kind of political system that's developed in the Chinese context, does this create challenges in terms of it engaging with the outside world? And I think it does. And the over-legalized view of international relations that I think is dominant in the West or in the United States also creates challenges in dealing with some states that are not comfortable with a firm set of rules. What's interesting is that I don't think this is a West versus East, because Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Singapore are pretty comfortable with whatever the rules-based system is today. Arguably, Vietnam is probably pretty comfortable unless it's human rights. So we see that there is buy-in, and we can't make the argument that it's authoritarian states versus democratic states, because there's a lot of different states that buy into this system and other states that don't necessarily buy into the system. And we see a growing number of authoritarian states that or semi-dictatorial states that are not comfortable with the rules-based system.
Yeah, you're right. I'm not sure if the Chinese relational governance model is exportable, but they have made some achievements. For example, we can take BRI as concrete examples. BRI has made huge progress, and for BRI there is no clear rule. Okay, it's unclear, and there is no formal institution. And China prefers a bilateral approach. They have signed many agreements with many countries. So this is a typical relational approach. So I think for many poor countries are comfortable with Chinese approach. They don't like clear and formal rules. They don't like that. Many countries has a very low level in terms of rule of law. Okay, so they prefer Chinese approach, and China is very good at that. Of course, this has led to a lot of problems, corruptions, and not transparent. So, and the violation of environmental standard and labor rights, many problems, I admit. So, but the reality is that many poor countries cannot meet the standard of rich countries. So they don't want to follow the Western model because it has very high standards. For example, many poor countries in Africa has complained that the Western aid and development support always have a lot of strict conditions or demands. For example, you have to respect human rights, you have to respect women rights, you have to protect the environment. But they are not in a position to meet a so high standard. So, but for the Chinese investment, they have always claimed we don't have any political condition. We just want to cooperate with you, and let's work together. Let's start. Okay, so therefore, many poor countries are very comfortable with Chinese approach. I'm not saying Chinese approach is good or better, but this is the reality. So But I personally prefer a rules-based order because this is actually better for the poor countries. But we also have to admit that we also have to acknowledge the reality.
I would agree with that. Yep. It's a challenge.
Indeed. Well, Luke, thank you for coming up. Good evening.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, thank you for the welcome. Yeah, really interesting discussion. I'm from Australia myself, and in the press recently is the Chinese building of a base in the Solomon Islands, which Australia has been trying to help over a number of years to help settle the political situation there. And I just find it really interesting that what Xiaoting was saying, that poor nations find it difficult to whether to have the lawyers or to have the financial backing to access and sometimes ratify or even have an interest in these international laws that might not even be applicable to them. I mean, it can even be for rich nations as well. I mean, I can remember back some politicians complaining about the having to read through and ratify a TTP agreement, which was essentially created by the US, and how difficult it was. That it had a limited amount of access. They had a limited amount of time before it had to be ratified. And I mean, Australia is not a poor nation, but yeah, I think these rules that are put into place can sometimes be stifling and can suit certain particular nations that have set these processes up. And yeah, I think when we look at these rules that are put into place, I think they can be used to an advantage or a disadvantage, depending on who's created, the particular rules. And if we take the UN, for example, the US was stepping away from its involvement in the UN, and China stood up and invested and has taken part in the UN. And say, for example, the rules for international seafaring, they were signed off by China. They were negotiated by China. And I think nations like Australia, the US, others, maybe say the Western countries, I'm not sure. But I think if they want to follow this rules-based logic, they need to step up to the plate as well. I think they need to ratify these and make them local, policies, and then they can be internationalized as well. Because I think, there was certain calls for certain nations to be, treated as, say, for example, war criminals. But then US and some of the nations weren't actually even part of the legal institution that could actually bring certain nations to justice. Like it's kind of a contradiction in terms. And I think if this rules-based theory is being used or as a strategy, then you have to kind of follow the rules yourself. Otherwise, it's like a kid saying, okay, you've got to do your piano practice, or, like you have to do that, but then you don't do it yourself, and then the kid's not going to respect you. And, sorry, it's a kind of simple example, but as a parent, that happens, you've got to be the leader and you've got to follow your rules so that others see how it makes sense. And then they can follow by it in a simplistic form. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Luke. So I do think that there is some good research that does show that there is some evidence that countries that do develop more rules-based, transparent development, legal systems and institutions, they did generally become more stable and more prosperous societies. There is a real question whether China can continue to grow moving forward without adopting these. And this is a real question that I don't think anybody knows the answer. But if we look at Japan is a relatively well-governed country with relatively strong institutions. It has its own democracy, regular elections, pretty good rule of law, and as a result, it's been able to develop quite stably. We saw South Korea transition from a democracy or from an authoritarian state that was driven by authoritarian politics towards a democratic state with more rules-based processes. Taiwan as well. Singapore used to be a much more a harder authoritarian state, and today it's a much more softer authoritarian state. So I think that there's real questions whether true development and comprehensive and long-term development does require rule of law. We don't know. China today is an experiment, and I think we just don't know the answer yet. The second question is, why do poor states prefer the non-legalistic, non-binding agreements with China? And I think, quite frankly, is that many of these states are poor, corrupt. They don't have democratic systems, and that the untied aid and the untied help keeps those corrupt stakeholders in power. So I think we need to be a little bit careful in saying that these are states that are, accepting the Chinese model without, understanding some of the reasons. Not all are like this, but many that accept Chinese aid openly and, issue rules and rules-based institutions are, the primary recipients of a lot of the aid that comes out of China. And we're just not sure if that's going to strengthen the corrupt systems and the poor governance, or it will improve governance. And again, it's too early to say.
Thank you, Stephen and Luke. Ken, hello. Are you there?
Hello. Yeah, yes.
Yes.
Maya, thank you always for setting up the room very interesting like this. And I
Goes to
raised
Stephen.
well, thank you, Professor Nagi. Actually, I raised my hand to ask one simple question. Let me elaborate my question. Although it's very simple, but let me go one by one. I'm a Japanese businessman based in Singapore, interested in this international relation subject. Maybe I didn't study much about the subject, or maybe I read very few books on the subject. I somehow led to believe that with, what was the name, Westphalian Treaty? In Japanese, we say Westphalia Joyaku.
Yeah, that's right. Westphalian Peace Treaty.
Yeah, 17th century, many years ago. And I thought we, as a human being, said goodbye to the medieval period when kings and the countries can just declare war to other country and change the borders if they wish. But after 100-year-long war in Europe, they met together somewhere in Germany, and then they decided to set some rules. So when I saw this title, Rule-Based Order, I somehow thought about that Westphalia Treaty of the 17th century. And somehow, among my Japanese businessman friend, we often talk about this Westphalia Joyaku, as if this is the beginning of this modern era. We are living in the world with rules. So I was curious that the discussion has been based on more on the regime after the World War II, where maybe U.S. the Western countries sort of dominate, set the rules. But to me, I thought we progressed from a medieval era with a very chaotic order to rule-based world since 17th century. And my question is how, when I see this rule-based order, can we go back to the 17th century, or we still haven't achieved rule-based order yet? Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. So I think that the so-called rules-based order that was established in the Westphalian period really was primarily for Europe. And I'm not sure how effective it was. We had the 100-Year War, of course. Napoleon invaded most of Europe and went all the way to Russia. Of course, we had the Civil War or the War of Independence between the United States and the UK. And of course, World War I and World War II were a pretty good demonstration of how elites of society could direct their societies towards what we call total war. So in the post-World War II period, many countries came together and they said, we need international institutions to ensure that we don't have another World War I and World War II. And they basically tried to create some institutions such as the United Nations and the International Criminal Tribunal as a tool to curb the power of states so they don't do what they did in World War I and World War II. So right now we've moved into a period of time where I think China is powerful enough to challenge the current international system. Russia has challenged the current international system. Frankly, the former administration in the United States, the Trump administration, challenged the international system in many ways. And these great powers are not controlled by international law. And it's a concern because what they do will affect countries like Japan or Australia or Bulgaria or Vietnam. And this is why I think, in particular, middle powers and smaller countries are really advocating for, working together to try and create an international system that really protects international law and promotes a rules-based order that curbs the behavior of great powers.
It has been there, but it's still in progress.
It's still in progress. I think it'll be in progress for many, many decades ahead.
Okay, just one quick question. So, given this international laws and set of rules, even a war needs to be justified, or invasion needs to be justified to certain conditions. Am I okay to understand this way?
So, in general, if you look at the most recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I think under international law, this would be seen as an illegal war in that Russia has invaded the Ukraine without the Ukraine directly attacking Russia. And, I think by international law, and I'm not a legal scholar, that this would be seen as an illegal war. This is why I think the United Nations General Assembly has voted against, or had a very strong motion against Russia, and that even some countries abstained from, Russia's friends abstained from the vote to take a position that does not support the war, but does not alienate Russia. So it's a very complicated system, and I think we're still in a process of trying to see how we can create an international system that can not only shape the behavior of smaller states, but shape the behavior of big states like the United States, Russia, and China. And we have an expression: there's no global policeman. There's nobody that can arrest the United States or China or Russia. And as a result, those big states end up doing what they want on issues that are important to them. And what we've seen that with regards to the building of artificial islands in the South China Sea. We've seen this with the Russians helping the Syrians to push back against the West. And we've seen this with the invasion of the Ukraine. And we've seen it with the former administration in Washington, quitting the Paris Climate Accords, threatening partners. And this is something that we're still trying to figure out how we can control the behavior of those big states.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Leonor and Amar and Chao-Ting, also Lin, for coming up on stage. Thank you very much for coming up and being part of this discussion. Thank you, Luke, as well, for joining the discussion and for your questions. So the next session will be on the 2nd of May, and it will be about the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook. So join us again at that point. Of course, you can also join the Japanese Politics Room every Sunday morning at 8:20 with Timothy Langley. And that's it for the moment. Stephen, a few words from you before I close the room.
Just a word of thanks to everybody, and hopefully that you can spend some time thinking about what's happening in Eastern Europe with Ukraine, and send some support to them. I think it's in our interest to support Ukraine and support smaller countries not being bullied by larger countries. And that was very much the topic today. I wish you good health, a good evening, and I look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you, Stephen. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.